Boa noite a todo mundo. Temos aí um convidado ilustre hoje à noite. A Aditya veio para o Brasil para o evento que vai ter esse fim de semana, né? O EIVA, que ele vai ser junto com a VegFest, né? A VegFest ela é organizada todos os anos pela SVB, e o EIVA é uma conferência que acontece internacional, que acontece algumas vezes por ano. EIVA significa Animal... Como que é? Animal and Vegan Activism, né? Então, é um encontro de ativismo animal e vegano, e ele vai acontecer junto com a VegFest esse ano. A gente vai apresentar uma palestra lá, vai também estar junto com a gente no stand do Dr. Eficaz, representando a Animal Ethics. Então, a Aditya é coordenador da Animal Ethics, de divulgação, outreach, e ele também atualmente trabalha na Impact Academy, que é uma organização que ajuda pessoas que estão trabalhando que querem trabalhar com segurança de ar a se colocarem nas organizações. E é isso. Então, passo a palavra para a Aditya. Aditya, you can start now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aditya. In India, when we introduce ourselves, we say namaste. And thank you so much, Leo, for the introduction, and to the EA Brazil team for organizing this talk. It's really nice to be presenting about this important topic to you. I really like presenting the case for wild animal suffering to the EA audience, especially because people who believe in the effective altruism principles are quite interested in understanding how we can improve the world in the most effective ways. And so today, I would like to talk about this topic, which is wild animal suffering. Usually when we talk about cause areas in effective altruism, we look at importance, neglectedness, and tractability. A lot of people think, oh, wild animal suffering is important, it's neglected, but can we do anything about it? Is it tractable? So I will present a little bit more about this topic. If you're not familiar with it, I will give an introduction, and then we will talk about what we, as people who care about reducing suffering in the world, can do to make this world a better place. My name is Aditya, and I am the Asia Outreach Coordinator for Animal Ethics. We also have a Portuguese branch called Esta Animal. I have shared the link on the chat. So in this talk, which I expect to take around 30 minutes, I will briefly introduce the topic of what is wild animal suffering, and how is it different from conservation. And then I will talk about solutions and opportunities in this space, what we as people who are interested in reducing suffering can do about wild animal suffering. So what is wild animal suffering? So when I talk about this issue, people usually think about biodiversity protection or conservation of species. But the reason we call it as wild animal suffering and not wildlife protection is because here I am referring to suffering of sentient beings. When I say sentient beings, I refer to beings that have the capacity to feel pleasure and to suffer. A plant or a rock might not be a sentient being because it does not have the capacity to suffer. And how is it different from conservation or biodiversity protection? Because in conservation or biodiversity protection, we are talking about preserving habitats, ecosystems, rivers, which are not sentient. Whereas when I talk about wild animal suffering, I'm referring to individual sentient beings. And When I talk about wild animal suffering, I am not just referring to the harms that humans cause animals, but I'm also referring to any harm that animals in the wild suffer. Now, here, when I say wild animal, there are some wild animals in zoos or for farming or for any other reason they are in captivity. I'm not referring to wild animals in captivity, but I'm referring to animals that are outside human control. So when I say wild animal suffering, I'm referring to animals that are outside human control and that are suffering due to any cause, whether it is a harm caused by humans or if it is a harm caused by natural reasons. Now, what does suffering in the wild for wild animals look like? And when I talk about it, people usually think about, oh, a lion hunting a deer. But animals in the wild undergo different forms of harm that are excruciatingly painful, that are very, very painful. I will give you a few examples, but I want to tell here that some of the images in the next few slides might be a little painful. So if you are sensitive to images of suffering, I would request you to not look at the next few slides. So this example here is of animals that are suffering from extreme cold. So weather conditions are a common source of suffering in the wild. These are wild donkeys in Turkey, and during the extreme winter, they all froze. So they weren't able to eat food, move, etc. They just huddled together and they froze. Fortunately, they didn't end up dying, but one can only imagine the amount of agony and misery that a being undergoes when they are, frozen. Similarly, during weather conditions like a cyclone or a hailstorm, animals frequently get injured due to the heavy winds. They get injured. Their birds' wings are broken, or animals are injured by the wood or the trees or the debris falling from the sky. So injuries are another very common source of suffering in the wild during weather conditions. Starvation and famine are another common source of suffering in the wild during droughts or during extreme climatic conditions when there is no food. Animals have a very difficult time finding food, and they walk for long distances trying to find water or food. And sometimes when they are unable to find it, they start consuming their own body fat and die a very slow and painful death. Usually when we watch natural documentaries, the suffering of animals is glorified because it's nature and everything that is natural is good. But one can only imagine from the perspective of this wild animal that was traveling for a very long distance in the search of food or water, the experience of suffering that this animal might have undergone. Disease is another very prevalent source of suffering in the wild. It involves animals getting afflicted with different forms of diseases. This could be, in this condition, for a rabbit, it has this disease called as myxotomasis, where it's a fungal infection which infects the skin of a rabbit, and it's very, very painful, and they are unable to eat food, and within 12 days, they usually suffer a lot and end up dying. In the cities, we as humans, we have access to medical aid. Our pet animals, they have access to medical aid. Even if they are farm animals, the farmers have an interest in giving medical aid to animals to keep them profitable. But animals in the wild, they usually have no access to any form of medical care or vaccination, etc. So a lot of animals, when they are affected by diseases, they suffer a lot and they die. Similarly, during natural disasters, I don't need to talk about natural disasters in Brazil because unfortunately I hear every year the news of forest fires in Brazil, where a lot of animals die from forest fires. Similarly, this is an image from India where there are floods every year in the national park, and many animals die by drowning. So this is another source of suffering in the wild. But when I talk about wild animals, I'm not just referring to animals that are in the forests. There are many wild animals that are urban. They stay in the urban environments, like pigeons, rats, squirrels, snakes, and many more examples, raccoons. So all of these animals have adapted to living with humans, but they are not exactly domestic. They are urban wild animals. And so when I talk about wild animal suffering, I am also talking about urban wild animals and the suffering that they undergo. This could involve getting affected by diseases, lack of food, water, parasites, uh, competition like fights between two different animals where they injure themselves and they end up dying. And I also include the harms that humans cause to wild animals. So a lot of humans try harming urban wild animals, whether it's rats, squirrels, pigeons, etc. And another source of suffering in the wild is when animals compete for limited amount of food, territory, sexual mates, uh, or it could just be due to aggression over territory. So these animals usually fight until death, or they fight until one of them is seriously injured and backs away. So this is another source of harm that animals in the wild undergo. And as I mentioned, when I talk about wild animal suffering, I'm not excluding the harm that humans cause to wild animals. Hunting, for example, is one way in which humans try to harm animals, whether it is for entertainment, for conservation reasons. A lot of us think that conservationists care about animals. No, they care about some species of animals. I'm sure a lot of you must have heard about speciesism, which is discrimination of animals based on their species. We treat a dog or a cat like really well, but if it's a pig or a fish or uh, a cow, we use them for profit and we don't care about their suffering. Similarly, in the wild, people care about some species of animals. A jaguar, a panda, a lion, a tiger. Wow, they are extremely valuable for conservation. If it's a wild boar, if it's a rat, if it's a snake, nah, I don't really care about their welfare. So humans do cause harm to animals that they don't care about. And this could be for entertainment or for other reasons, like I mentioned. So this is another source of suffering as well. But why am I talking about this issue to EAs? Why should we think that this is an important issue? Why should we expect that there is a lot of suffering in the wild? Well, one way in which a lot of wild animals reproduce, their reproductive strategy, is where they give birth to a huge number of offsprings, a huge number of babies, out of which a very few of them end up surviving. One example of this is the turtles here. Uh, Over the course of the lifetime, a turtle gives birth to over 600 offsprings. Sorry, in a single clutch, in a single birth, they give birth to over 600 eggs. And once they hatch, if I ask you, how do you think most turtles die? People might say, oh, maybe humans might harm them. Oh, maybe they might, suffer due to fishing nets, etc. But most turtles die within 1 week of coming into existence. Within 1 week, over 99% of these turtles end up dying. And how do they die? Parasites, predation, uh, being eaten upon by like the parasites. I think I already mentioned parasites, predation, and then also suffering due to thirst and hunger. Sometimes they get disoriented and go the wrong way. Uh, there is also competition for food. And sometimes just due to exposure to sunlight, a lot of them end up dying. So a lot of these turtles that come into existence, they don't have enough opportunities to have positive experiences. Most of them live for a very short time and they end up dying in painful ways. And this is the reality for a large population of animals in the wild. So, just to put this into perspective, how many wild animals are there? Like the number of humans is 8 billion, so 10 to the power 8. The number of farmed animals is expected to be between 50 billion to 1 trillion, which is 10 to the power 11. But if you include aquatic animals, the fishes that we fish out of the oceans, it's estimated to be 10 to the power 13. So if humanity was a coin, and if the farmed animals was an envelope, and if the aquatic animals was a doormat, a floor mat, and I hope it's being translated well, then the number of wild animals, if we include the invertebrates, when I say invertebrates, like the arthropods, like spiders, etc., which might very well have the capacity to experience pain and pleasure, that could be represented by a big football field. So 3 city blocks or something like that. So it's estimated that there are about 10 to the power 19 wild animals, which includes arthropods. If we include like even smaller animals, the number is much more larger. So a vast majority of these wild animals reproduce in ways where they give birth to a huge number of offsprings, but a very few of them end up surviving. Another example is of a bullfrog. It's estimated that they give birth to around 10,000 tadpoles. Now, one can debate whether tadpoles are sentient or not, but if they are sentient, then there's a large number of sentient beings that a single couple of bullfrog produces, out of which most of them end up dying. It's estimated that less than 1% of the offsprings that a bullfrog lays end up surviving. Most of them end up dying due to cannibalism, due to parasites, or being eaten by predators. And sometimes when there is a lot of sunlight and the puddle dries, all of them end up dying. So this is the case for most of the small animals in the wild. Even butterflies, they give birth to around 400 offsprings, and it's estimated that less than 6% of them survive. So 94% of butterflies, when they are in their caterpillar stage, etc., they don't end up surviving. They usually end up suffering and dying. So in this way, the majority of animals that come into existence in the wild, they live a very short life. They don't have enough opportunity to have positive experiences, and they end up dying quite soon in painful ways. So the net welfare in a given ecosystem might very well be negative because a majority of them end up suffering and dying. But even if that was not the case, that the net welfare of a given ecosystem is not negative, a significant percent of the population of animals in the wild are having pretty terrible lives. They are suffering a lot and they are dying quite soon. So they do need our help. Now, I have presented this issue. I have talked about different forms of suffering of animals in the wild. I have talked about the scale of the issue. I have talked about how it is likely that there are so many forms of suffering, and because of the reproductive strategy, it's likely that majority of the animals have a pretty bad life. But what can we actually do about it? Well, the situation is not that pessimistic. One might feel like, oh, we cannot do anything about animals in the nature. Ecosystems are very complex, and humans don't care about wild animals. But humans have been helping some animals. For example, elephants. Elephants are really adored upon. And this is an example of in India, where there is a hospital built for elephants. And when the mother dies, the orphan elephants are given medical treatment, or they're rehabilitated, or if they are injured, they are given medical care. Similarly, during forest fires, This is an example from Australia in 2019 wildfires, and they have wildfires very frequently, like in Brazil. And people really like some cute animals like koalas. And we do see humans going out of their way to provide food and water and medical care to wild animals. It's also the same with some aquatic animals. During the tides, some whales and sharks, they get disoriented. And when the water goes back, they get stuck on the shore. And very often, we see communities of people come together to bring these animals back into the oceans. So there is some concern and care among humans for wild animals, even if the cause of their suffering is natural. This is an example in India. There are also a lot of indigenous tribes that do care about the welfare of wild animals. So when there is drought or lack of food, we see tribes in India coming to feed animals so they don't starve to death. And this is the same. There are many examples of tribals in different parts of the world who do care about welfare of wild animals, at least some species. And this is the same example from Turkey, where when there is harsh winter, they give food in these small cans. And it's not like animals are not benefited from it. Animals are helped from it, and they do consume this food, and they do survive. I also did mention that disease is a very prevalent form of suffering in the wild. But humans have been researching ways of helping animals in the wild. This is a paper from 1988, where humans were trying to understand how we can vaccinate animals against rabies. It's important to keep in mind here that the reason why people are studying this is not for the benefit of wild animals, but so that rabies doesn't affect humans or the farmed animals. But in any case, they did research this. They did develop the vaccine for rabies. They put it in these cookies. And once they put it in these cookies, they dropped the cookies from the helicopter in North America and many parts of Europe. And because of interventions like this, a large part of North America is now free from rabies. Similarly is the case with Europe. So these interventions do work on a large scale as well. Animals are benefited from it, even if it is done for the benefit of humans. So these are some examples of what could be done. But what else can be done? Given the huge population of animals in the wild, things might seem quite complicated. But there are things that we as effective altruists can do to improve the situation. Now, I understand that a lot of you might be thinking that, oh, ecosystems are very complex. Nature is very complex. And if we try to help some animals, that can have indirect impacts and can affect other species of animals. So how do we understand this? Well, there are many complex systems that humans constantly interfere with. It could be in medicine, it could be in conservation, it could be in climate. There are many examples of complex phenomenon. And what humans do is they first engage in research. The same is the case with ecology. Humans first studied how ecosystems function. What are the relationships between different factors in an ecosystem? And then they interfere in the wild to kind of make changes in the ecosystem. So similarly, also with wild animal welfare science, what we can do is we can do a lot of research, create this field of study, try to understand which animals are sentient, what are their experiences like, how can we responsibly help them in the wild. It's not like I'm asking you to go out there and randomly feed all wild animals without taking into consideration what the consequences are. I am recommending, the organizations working in this field are recommending that we do more research. Try understanding what are the different outcomes. How can we responsibly help animals? It's also important to do outreach. 10 years ago, if I talked about wild animal welfare science, people would have been like, you're crazy. People don't care about other humans. Why would they care about wild animals? But we see 10 years down the line, due to advocacy and outreach by a lot of people, there is growing interest in this field. Similarly, even in conservation science in the 1960s, there was not a lot of interest. But once people did a lot of outreach, there was growing public interest in this space. So outreach is another important thing to do. Lobbying, of course. What we have studied and learned is that in conservation science, it was mostly lobbying and changing policies that caused the most impact. Similarly, what we could do is we could lobby for policies to include a component for wild animal welfare. If we are deciding to reforest a land, people take into consideration different factors like sustainable income for local livelihoods. They take into consideration the economic factors. They take into consideration the ecology, how that's affected by it, how agriculture is affected by it. Similarly, we can also include wild animal welfare component. We could also include, oh, if we reforest in this way, if we include these trees, then it would affect the wild animals negatively. So let us try making it better. So policy change is one thing that people can do. Implementation as well. Like I mentioned, there are examples of interventions that we could already implement, like vaccinating wild animals, rescuing them, and I will also present some more examples that could be done, like helping urban wild animals that are not out there in the wild but are in the cities, like pigeons or squirrels or rats, etc. And funding is another thing that people can do because this area is very funding constrained. The field of wild animal welfare is only 4 or 5 years old. And so organizations in this field are heavily funding constrained. Conservation, on the other end, gets like millions of dollars, more than, yeah, like I would even say it gets billions of dollars. But animal welfare, if you look at animal welfare, then around 250 million goes to farmed animals. Whereas for wild animals, you could think that it's around 10 million. So billions for conservation, millions for, uh, yeah, like the farm animal welfare, and then like less than 10 million for wild animal welfare. So there is, yeah, a definite need for funding in this space. And who are the organizations working on this? It's Wild Animal Initiative. They do a lot of research, scientific research to understand how we can help wild animals. Us, Animal Ethics, we do more outreach to public and to academics to increase awareness about this issue. There is Rethink Priorities that does more foundational research, like how do we compare the welfare of one species to the other? Which group of animals are sentient? So these are the kinds of questions that they work on. Then NYU Wild Animal Welfare. So initially, there was no reputable organization that was working on this. But once New York University started working on wild animal welfare, a lot of academics and scientists started taking this issue seriously. So they work on a lot of policy issues as well. Now, when I talk about this, there are three common objections that come up. One is that, oh, ecosystems are complex. We can't do anything about it. And two is, it is very strange for the public. They will not accept this issue. And three is, oh, scientists will not be interested on working on this research. They will only be interested on working on issues where there is a lot of public interest. So I will try to briefly address each of them, given that I don't have a lot of time. So as I mentioned before, complexity should not be a reason for us to not do anything about it. As I mentioned, there is possibly a large scale of suffering in the wild. It is very neglected. There are only 4 organizations working on this. And even when there is complexity, humans have done research and have interfered or have done interventions in the complex phenomenon and have tried to gain more information to reduce the uncertainty and then implement interventions. So there is definitely things that we can do despite complexity to improve the situation of animals in the wild. And second, when people say that it is strange for the public, that has not really been our experience. Yes, it is a new issue. Yes, people are very resistant to it. But once you show examples of how we can help animals in the wild and how animals are already being helped, like I showed, vaccination or rescuing animals, feeding programs, then people start realizing that, oh, it's not really out there. It's not, oh, a lion eats a deer and I'm stopping the lion from eating a deer. But there are things that you can do that is not very controversial. And regarding the third point, that scientists don't like it, to test this, we at Animal Ethics did a survey among different scientists and students in academia, uh, where we interviewed different scholars and students in life sciences. This was in biological science, environmental science, and animal science. And we did a survey. And this was from different countries, including Brazil, but also, 19 other countries. This is for the students, and this is for the scholars. For the scholars, we covered more countries. And what we recognized is that we tried asking them what are the forms of interventions that they would support. And we found 3 forms of interventions that they are usually in favor of supporting. So one is vaccinating wild animals, because as we saw, diseases from animals in the wild can frequently infect farmed animals, or in some cases also infect humans, like in the case of coronavirus. So scientists are in favor of researching and understanding how we can prevent the diseases from coming in wild animals. And the second case that they were in favor was urban wild animals, because they are in frequent contact with humans. There is less resistance to helping them, because usually there is this perception that, oh, we should not interfere with animals in the wild. But because urban wild animals are already influenced by us, there is more support for it. And the third line of intervention that they were in favor was helping animals in weather events, because a lot of people believe that climate change is a human caused issue, and because in many ways humans have impacted all the natural mechanisms in the world. So there is this tendency that because we are partially responsible for these weather events, we should help the wild animals as well that are affected by disasters or climate events. We found similarly among scholars as well, they were also in favor of helping animals through these interventions. So these were some examples of how we can help animals in the wild and what can be done about it. And as I showed, some objections that people have don't really hold up. There is still a lot of promise that we can help a large group of animals in the wild out there and decrease the suffering in the world significantly. And that has been our mission at Animal Ethics, to do more outreach and research in defense of animals. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can check out our website. We cover wild animal suffering, ethics, sentience, exploitation, etc. We have also translated our website into different languages so that this information is made available to different countries. We have also translated with the help of volunteers from Brazil into Portuguese. So if you're interested in learning about this, I would highly recommend you check it out. We have a very active team in Brazil that is doing a lot of outreach and research in defense of animals. One such program that we are doing is a podcast, which is called Ethicast. We do it on first Friday of every month, where we interview people and we cover different topics. We have also released a book called Introduction to Wild Animal Suffering, where we cover this issue in much more depth. And yes, Luciano, who will also be talking soon, I have seen, has also written a few books on this issue, which talks about animal ethics and wild animal suffering. This is another book written by Luciano as well. So if you're interested in learning more about this issue, I would highly recommend checking it out. If you're interested in watching videos about this issue on our YouTube channel, Animal Ethics, we also have a Portuguese channel, Ética Animal, where you can find many videos covering different topics about speciesism, about wild animal suffering, and multiple other issues like sentience, etc. This was the book that I mentioned earlier. And if you're interested in interacting and learning about this issue in the form of AI, we have released this chatbot called Senti, where you can type your questions and Senti will provide answers to it. It's available on our website. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope I was able to make a persuasive case about wild animal suffering and that you have learned more about this issue after this talk. I'm happy to accept questions and do my best to answer them. Thank you very much.